The phone lit up with Alina's name at the exact moment Miriam leaned over my shoulder to show me our granddaughter's recital dress, a tiny blue thing with sequins like raindrops. And in that breath between the buzz and Miriam's smile freezing, my whole life split clean as a wishbone. She didn't say a word at first. Just followed the light in my eyes down to the screen, read the name. Then looked up at me the way people look at a street they've driven 1,000 times and suddenly realize they've missed their turn for years. Miriam has always been gentle with objects, books opened at the spine with a palm, porcelain cups placed just so in the cabinet, and she set the phone down the same way, like it might shatter if touched too hard, then asked, soft as a piano lid closing, "Who is Elena?" The living room smelled of cumin and grilled onions from the fajitas I'd made. A clumsy celebration of our long marriage and the coming recital, and outside, Austin's summer heat pressed against the windows. Cicadas working their relentless engine in the pecan tree. Everything ordinary. Everything ours, except the name vibrating on the table. Mouth dry, I said the lying version first, that she was a librarian at the community center. Someone helping me sort a donation, but Miriam's eyes didn't move from my face, and the light in them went from warm to winter. She didn't yell. She didn't throw anything. She stepped back and rested her knuckles on the counter as if bracing for a tremor, and asked me to say the honest version. Answers lodged behind my tongue like a fishbone. A glass clinked. The fridge hummed. A drop of grease popped from the skillet and landed on my wrist. A small sting that made my pulse lurch. And when silence stretched long enough to become its own confession, Miriam nodded once, reached into her purse for car keys, and said she was going to stay with our daughter for the night. My hand tried to find hers. She turned away so gently it felt like forgiveness and punishment at once. The door closed with the quiet of a verdict. Our house, single-story limestone, oak floors we'd saved up to install in our 40s. The kitchen island that had hosted 100 birthdays grew too large for my breath. I stood there with a spatula in my hand and a stain on my wrist and the word Elena pulsing on the screen. Not a moment I'm proud of, but that is how this story must begin. With a name in light and a wife walking out before the fajitas cooled. Elena entered months earlier in a less dramatic way, sliding a worn paperback across the circulation desk at the East Cesar Chavez branch. The novel smelled of dust and citrus cleaner and something lavender I'd come to recognize as hers, and when I flipped it open to the title page, a phone number was scrawled along the spine in looping script. 50, maybe, with a streak of silver in her black hair that she wore like an earned medal. Elena carried herself as if time had taught her to claim space without apology. I'd gone there to donate boxes of books left from my consulting days. Shelves of business titles and biographies that made me feel important once. She asked questions most people don't ask retirees. What had I given up to live quieter? What did I miss at night when the television was off? What kind of noise did my life still make? A laugh started low in her throat when she heard I'd kept a list of novels I pretended to read, but never did, and she tapped the paperback with a nail painted a plain, practical beige and said, "Try this. And call me when you hate it or love it." That daring was a small match tossed into the dry brush of my careful routines. At home, Miriam and I had grown into a kindness that sometimes looked like distance. She worked part-time at a pediatric clinic, brought home stories of nervous parents and brave toddlers, kept up the herb garden even when the basil bolted in the heat. I grilled tinkered with the old Ford, scheduled physical therapy for my stubborn knee, paid bills. We were steady. We were good. We had decades of holidays layered like rings in a tree. We also drifted to our corners of the couch most nights, reading our separate screens until sleep nudged us to bed. Somewhere after 60, the air had thinned around us. No villains. No storms. Just a quiet that began to sound like absence if you listened long enough. Elena slipped into that space with the precision of a librarian finding the exact shelf. Coffee turned into lunch near the river. Lunch into wine at a bistro off South First where the ceiling fans made the whole place feel like an old movie. She asked about my first job, the first time I ever broke a promise. The first lie I told my father. I asked about her transfer from San Antonio years ago. Her split marriage, the grown daughter who texted once a week in bursts of emojis and silence. We did not talk about Miriam. When Elena mentioned a poetry reading, my chest warmed at being invited into something that wasn't a checkup or a church potluck. She took me to a bar with sticky tabletops and a mic that squealed at the start. A young man read about loss in an earnest voice. And Elena leaned into my shoulder and whispered a joke about metaphors that made me snort laugh. Like a teenager, she glanced at my mouth. The room tilted. Outside, under the neon, she pressed me against brick gently, as if even now consent could be withdrawn with dignity, and we kissed. The kiss tasted of lime and the faint smoke of mezcal and fear. A heartbeat later, guilt arrived like an aftershock. Back at the house, Miriam dozed with a podcast humming softly from the bedside speaker. Hands folded on her stomach the way she sleeps when a long day finally lays her down. And I stood in the doorway counting my breaths until the hot shame settled enough to slide under the covers without shaking the mattress. In the morning, I made steel-cut oats and apologized for being distant the night before. Blaming my knee, Miriam kissed my cheek and told me to schedule the physical therapist. And when she laughed at a joke I lifted from a sitcom to prove I was fine, something in my chest pinched in a way that felt like warning. The affair grew by small permissions. A drive east to Bastrop for a part for the Ford became a motel with a broken ice machine and a window unit that rattled. We wrote each other notes that lived folded in my wallet, hers with the faint lavender scent, mine with block letters as if neatness could excuse the content. Elena wanted to know my kitchen habits and my regrets. She learned I count to 3 before flipping eggs to settle my nerves and that I keep a list of apologies I never sent. She teased, then held my face when teasing no longer suited the moment. We met at the community center sometimes in an empty classroom stacked with folding chairs. The hallway's fluorescent buzz reminding me our ages don't excuse teenage decisions. Every rendezvous left a mark, a wrinkle in a shirt, a hair on a coat. A text that arrived at the wrong minute, and I started lying with more care, then with less. Because that is how a man slides. First you say you're picking up mulch. Then you pick up desire, then you forget which story you told and who you told it to. Miriam, to her credit, never played detective. She asked how the Ford ran, reminded me about the recital date, sent me a link for garden kneeling pads. When I sat next to her on Sunday at St. Jude's hymn book open, the words rose from my throat and turned to ash somewhere behind my tongue. After church, a neighbor with a kind mustache asked if we'd join the community cleanup. And Miriam said yes for both of us. I watched her sign our names, the gentle slope of her handwriting, the certainty of her. Meanwhile Elena texted, reading room at 5. I'll wear the green dress. I typed can't and then deleted it. At the cleanup, Miriam laughed with a woman whose husband had just had his hip replaced. We bagged plastic and beer cans from the creek. When a teenager yelped at a water snake, Miriam stepped closer to me without looking. The way long habits make bodies align. The smallest gestures become the loudest indictments once you start keeping score. The first time Miriam almost discovered us, I was sloppy. A message preview bloomed across my screen at dinner. A poem Elena had copied with a line highlighted, "Love is not a ledger. It's a plunge," and my fork froze. Miriam reached for the salt, eyes flicking to the phone, then to my face. "New reading list?" she said. I nodded, too quickly. Anxiety rose so high it buzzed behind my teeth. I excused myself, locked the bathroom, sat on the edge of the tub counting grout lines. 48, 49, 50, until the panic swam back to shallow water. I promised myself it would end. I promised Elena it wouldn't. A man can keep contradictory vows long enough to ruin 3 lives if he practices. 2 days later I told Elena we needed space. She slid her hand off mine, back straight, mouth composed like a librarian at a noisy desk, and said, "You're going to lose both of us this way." Then she kissed the place on my cheek where Miriam had kissed me that morning and left me in the parking lot feeling like a thief too tired to run. I ignored her for a week. Miriam and I went to our granddaughter's rehearsal at the school auditorium. Watched a line of little girls try to hold their arms like wings. Miriam squeezing my forearm whenever a tutu nearly tipped. On the way home she asked if we should invite our son for brisket on Sunday. Her voice warmed. Plans unfurling like a flag, and for a mile I believed I could choose the safety of that warmth. Forever. Then a song came on the radio. Something Elena had played for me while we washed dishes at her apartment, her tiny sink. Her narrow window, a fern dying from too much faith, and it pulled my chest open with a hook. Greed is a quiet animal. It doesn't roar, it nudges. I texted Elena after midnight, "One more time." She replied with an address and the word keys. The apartment was on the 2nd floor of a building that pretended to be nicer than it was. False stone facade, a pool posted with rules no one read. Elena had left the door unlocked, candles lit to flatter what age denies. Billie Holiday low on a small speaker, lavender again but lighter, as if mercy had a scent. We didn't talk. Bodies can be both sacred and foolish on the same night. When the candles tunneled down to their last stubborn glow, she put her chin on my chest and asked whether Miriam still laughed at my old jokes. "Sometimes," I said. "Does she still bring you coffee in bed? On Sundays? And you still want me to be a secret?" I didn't answer. A train horn blew 2 miles away and our silence filled with the heavy freight of what we weren't going to name. I slipped out before dawn. That thin blue hour when Austin feels like it belongs to the stray cats and bakery trucks. At home, Miriam slept on her side, back to my half of the bed. I showered too long, then brewed coffee strong enough to scald a conscience. We drank on the patio among tomato vines and wind chimes. She asked about the cleanup. I told a story about a water snake and a brave teenager. The chimes made a thin music that made me feel like a liar inside a pretty song. Days trickled by like that until the night the phone lit up while Miriam leaned in to share the dress photo. That single vibration collapsed all my practiced compartmentalizing. When she left with her keys, I stood in the doorway and watched the taillights melt into the street. Elena called 3 times in a row. I let it ring twice and then answered. Voice low and raw as a scraped knee. "She saw your name," I said. A long breath on the other end. I could picture her pinching the bridge of her nose the way she does when a patron returns a book with coffee rings. Daniel, she said, you can end this with courage or you can let it rot you. Those are the only two options left. Help me figure out which one, I said, pathetic even to my own ears. No, she said, not unkind. This part is yours. After the call I opened the pantry and stared at the shelves, cans lined up like soldiers. A jar of honey crystallized at the bottom. Miriam's neat labels on flower containers, as if order could be borrowed by osmosis. My hands shook. I knocked over the cumin. Brown dust breathed up like a curse. I cleaned it with a damp towel and realized I was wiping a stain that would never completely disappear, no matter how many times a man circles it with a cloth. I slept on the couch. At dawn, a text arrived from our daughter. Mom's here. She's okay. You two need to talk when you're ready. There was no accusation in it, which somehow felt worse. I sent back a heart and stared at the blue bubble like a coward's prayer. At the community center later that morning, yes. I was foolish enough to go. I found Elena shelving returns with the efficiency of someone who understands the choreography of paper. She didn't look up, only said, "We're not doing this here." A child dragged a picture book past my shoe and asked his father what a giraffe feels like. And the father said, like a broom in a fur coat, making the kid giggle. I envied the clean simplicity of that answer. After closing time, in a side room with a bulletin board full of volunteer flyers, I told Elena about the dress photo, about Miriam's voice, about the way my body had tried to reach for my wife's hand even while my head scrambled for a lie. Elena stood with her back to the window, sunlight turning the silver in her hair to a blade. You want me to say choose me, she said, and I won't. You want me to say go back to her, and I won't. I'll only say this. Love that requires you to be two different men is not love. It's theater, and the curtain always falls. I love you came out before I could cage it. She flinched, barely, but enough. Then love me enough to stop hurting everyone, she said. Keys clinked in the hallway. A janitor pushed a mop bucket past. We stood in a silence dense as felt. When I reached for her, she stepped aside so gently I almost missed it. Go, she said. Go be brave. Call your wife. Tell her the truth without wanting a reward. Back home, I dialed Miriam and hung up twice before letting the ring go through. She answered on the second ring, breath steady. Can we talk? I asked. Tomorrow, she said. At the house. Noon. Okay, Daniel? A vein in my neck ticked. Yes. Bring the truth. The line clicked silent. Noon became a cliff jutting out of the next day. I wiped the counter again, pointless circles. Outside, thunder stitched itself over the hill country and rolled toward town. The house went dim, the kind of dim that makes a person aware of their heartbeat. I should have eaten something. I poured water and forgot to drink it. The storm arrived early, split the air, and the kitchen light flickered, then steadied. When the doorbell rang at 11:58, 2 minutes early, Miriam always early, I walked to the entry with a resolve that felt like a suit borrowed from a better man. I opened the door, ready to say everything. It wasn't my wife. Elena stood on the porch with rain darkening her green dress to the color of moss. Hair wet and wild, eyes lit with a purpose that made my stomach drop. I tried to give you space, she said over the thunder. But you need to see this before you talk to her. From her tote she pulled a small leather-bound notebook, swollen at the edges with water, and pressed it into my palm. Open to the back. The pages smelled of damp and lavender and something metallic. On the last page, in Miriam's handwriting, a date and a tidy line. The day I realized my husband is a stranger. Under it, in a different, looping script I knew too well, a reply, he isn't a stranger. He's two people. Choose one. I looked up at Elena, rain ticking off the porch roof. The world narrowing to the space between us. And behind her, through the watery light at the end of the street, a familiar sedan turned the corner and slowed in front of our house. Miriam's car. Elena whispered, "Decide now," and the doorbell chimed again.